All right, hello everyone. We're about to start on our first session for Glasgow Clinical Anatomy Society. We'll be doing bones. So it's going to be the different types of bones, the structure and function, and the cells of the bones themselves. Okay. So let's begin with just a brief overview of what's going to happen in the session. So we're going to talk about the bone structure. This is including the macroscopic structure of the bone, microscopic structure of the bone and their cells, and compact versus cancellous bone. We're going to briefly talk about bone function, so that's your bone formation and repair. And we're going to talk about it in a simple way, basically what you need for your exams. We're going to do some sample questions and answers. And at the end of the day, we'll also do a Q&A session, so you can ask any questions, give any feedback, or anything that needs to be repeated. Session shouldn't take too long. We aim to make this a weekly thing, and it's going to be based on your feedback to see what you guys like and what you felt that was not covered that well by the university and what needs a bit more explanation. Okay, let's move on. So let's start with the macroscopic structure of the bone. I'll split this up into the parts of the bone. So we'll start with the diaphysis, the metaphysis, and the epiphysis. So diaphysis just means the long part of the bone, okay? And it's basically the shaft of the bone, and it's, or the body. It's where you'll have, the most of the length of the bone in the long bones. Then you have the epiphysis, so there's the proximal and the distal, depending on the portion and the type of bone. So since this is the humerus, this would be proximal, this would be distal. It's always what's closest to the body. Now you can have different ends, right? And if we look at this a little bit further, it just means one side or the other. That's the Latin meaning. It means the one where the bone grows. Then we have the metaphysis. What's important here is that it's between the diaphysis and the epiphysis, and it's very important because it has a function in growth. So in the metaphysis, you will find the epiphyseal line, which starts as cartilage, and then as you get older and older, the cartilage sort of grows and turns into bone. And this ossification process is what makes your bones grow. Now, it's the type of cartilage you find here. It's a hyaline cartilage, and this is the one that eventually ossifies because the bone cells invade and they turn it into bone from cartilage. And the clinical point here, which they might ask you about, is that the epiphyseal line, if you have a fracture here, if you have a fracture right through here, like let's say you get a fracture here, then that will damage the fibrocartilage and it will slow your growth. Now on an x-ray, when you see this, it will be seen as a line, right? You'll see like as if two bones separate in a child. In an adult, this will be all turned into bone. So the epiphyseal line in a child or a growing adult is made from fibrocartilage and becomes bone eventually. Speaking of cartilage, we have the articular cartilage. So the articular cartilage, it sort of covers the epiphysis so that it can articulate with other bones. It's very important because this is what ensures the cushioning. And as you can see, there's not many blood vessels coming into it, so its blood supply is very poor. So once you get damaged, that's basically, it doesn't regenerate very easily. We also have that it's usually hyaline cartilage, and it's the mixture of these different compositions that enable it to be a good shock absorber. Now for the periosteum, so periosteum, if you can think about it, it's like the wrapper around the bone. So you have the bone itself, but the periosteum, it's like connective tissue. So whenever you think connective tissue, think blood vessels, think supportive tissue, right? Bone is the main tissue and the periosteum as if it's like the scaffolding or the wrapping around it. And you have these Sharpie's fibers, which we will go into later, but they attach the periosteum to the bone. And the periosteum is very important because you have the various nutrients, and when we look into the microstructure, you'll see its importance there. but it's very important to know it's called sharp piece fibers or perforating fibers. We move on to the medullary cavity, which is this part here. So this here would be the medullary cavity. And what we find here is that it's the hollow part of the bone. You might find some fatty yellow bone marrow. And the main purpose of the medullary cavity is so that the bone is not as heavy and so that it is easier to lift. Now, as you can see, the bulk of the bone, the top of the bone is not hollow. So this is not hollow, and this is not hollow either. And the reason for this is because these are the weight-bearing parts. So think of this as being a hip, right? This is the hip, this is your leg. You want the thickest parts to be the strongest at the top, and you don't want those to be hollow. Whereas if you want to move the bone, you want it to be hollow so that you can actually, the muscles have an easier time to biomechanically move the bones. And finally, we have the endosteum, which is a thin membrane. It's usually around 1 cell thick, and it lines the medullary cavity. And once again, it's a connective tissue. So when you think connective tissue, it's a supportive tissue, whereas the actual tissue, the bone, that's more of the functional tissue. It's very thin. It just lines it, and it ensures that it's all running smoothly. It's a supportive tissue. And moving on, we will talk briefly about the composition of bone. So the bone is made up of the organic and inorganic parts. So the inorganic parts, as you can all imagine, is the minerals. It's calcium-based. It's called calcium hydroxyapatite, which makes roughly 70% of all the bone matter, right? Now, the extracellular matrix is what's found outside the cells, and the extracellular matrix outnumbers the cells, right? So the cells, they make the matrix, they maintain the matrix, but what actually gives the bones their function is the matrix itself. So it's 70% organic, roughly 30% inorganic, organic. Now, the collagen that they use in bones is always collagen type 1, which is the majority of the organic material. And basically what the collagen ensures, collagen is just this, it's very tensile, it's very strong, but it's also flexible, right? And this collagen interacts with other non-collagenous proteins, which are called glycosaminoglycans and proteoglycans. Basically, there's just GAGs and proteoglycans. They are just proteins which have different amounts of glucose on them, and together they help attract water. So water is another main component here, and what water ensures is that you have resistance to compressions, and that it sort of provides more holistic structure so that the bone is stronger and adapted to its functions. Similarly, you might find collagen type 2 in cartilage. It serves a similar function there, where collagen type 2, it attracts the water, keeps it in its place, and makes sure that it acts as a cushion for articulation. But in the bone, collagen type 1 is strong, flexible, and that's what you need in bones. Now, the reason you need flexibility in bones is because you want them to adapt to different stress. So let's say you're standing, you're running. You need the bones to be able to adapt to the changes of mechanical stress. If you don't have that, then the bones become weak and flimsy. So collagen type 2 is very important. So now let's move on to the 3 cells of the bone. There are of course more cells inside of the bone, but these are the 3 main ones you need to sort of think about. So the first one are osteoblasts, and they sort of look, they're from the mesenchyme. That means, that they're not immune cells. So we'll talk about that a bit later. But they're mesenchymal cells. They come from pre-osteoblasts, and they differentiate into these circular-looking cells. They have very few projections. They look quite normal, right? And they can be quite big. Now, I like to remember this by saying B, to build the bone. So they secrete your collagens, type 1. They secrete your organic compounds, which is your glycosaminoglycans, so your GAGs, and your proteoglycans. And together they build the bone. So if you can think about the osteoblast as a factory, it's a factory that sort of builds up the bone material, which is called osteoid. And That's what makes up the bone, right? Now, we have an osteocyte, which is a mature osteoblast, so they become these things. And so these are osteoblasts which have produced the collagen, they've produced the osteoid, and they're surrounded by this extracellular matrix, right, by this bone tissue. They have these projections, right, and they're elongated, and these are used to communicate with other cells. And once they become surrounded by this extracellular matrix, they're no longer osteoblasts, they become maintenance cells, right? They don't build anymore, they just ensure that the bone tissue is healthy and that all the nutrients are provided for it. So these are one sort of family. So osteoblasts become osteocytes, osteoblasts are the bone builders, osteocytes are the bone maintainers. Then we have osteoclasts. So osteoclasts are completely separate from osteoblasts and osteocytes. They're from hematopoietic stem cells, which means they're immune cells, so they're derived from the bone marrow. And osteoclasts, basically, you can see all these numerous nuclei. So this is one, this is another, and you will see all this matter, right? And they have all, if you look at a microscope, they will have these granules. Now these granules here, they serve the purpose of breaking down the tissue. So they break down the bone, right? And a good way to remember that it's osteoclast, which carves the bone. And so they break down the tissue so it can be repaired, because it's old bone. So old bone needs to be broken down, then it gets repaired, and then it resorbs the calcium as well. So let's say, for example, you need calcium because your metabolic demand requires it. Well, bone is a good reservoir for calcium, so the whole signals to the body will tell the osteoclasts to go en masse and resorb bone tissue and get the calcium out. Now these osteoclasts, they come from immune cells, as we said before, and the way they form is that you have aggregates of basically monocytes. Monocytes are immune cells, which will become macrophages. So osteoclast is a sort of type of macrophage, but it's a group of these monocytes. So a lot of monocytes, around 50 or more, they get together, they fuse, and they produce this super big cell, right? So osteoclasts are much bigger, and they have this ruffled border right here, ruffled border, which helps release enzymes. And these enzymes, they attach to the bone, they start digesting the bone, and they then release the calcium. Now in pathology, such as osteoporosis, these osteoclasts become overactive, and therefore that the bone is broken down too much. And if it's broken down too much, the architecture of the bone, the stuff that keeps it together, will be disrupted. So this brings us to the compact versus cancellous bone. So within any bone, with any long bone, you have both of these. So you will have your osteons, or your compact bones, on the sort of outside, which provide the strength and the durability. And then you will have spongy or cancellous bone in the middle. And the way you can differentiate these two is that the compact bone forms from osteons. You see this nice little packed area here, whereas the cancellous bone has these trabecular little bones, and you can see they have these. This here is what they mean when they say a trabecular, right? So this is the trabecular thing, which just means tubes, right? Think of them as tubes. Whereas the compact bone does not have any of these. They form osteons, which go around a central canal known as an Haversian canal. So Haversian canal is just named after the guy who found them. They are the blood vessel around which the bone forms. And you'll have your artery there, lymphatic vessel, and vein. Now you also have these lamellae, which are the spaces in between these cells. As you can see, you'll have osteoblasts on the outside and osteoclasts, and the balance between these two maintains the bone. And then you'll have osteocytes, which are osteoblasts, which are matured on the inside, and as you can see, they're communicating. So these osteocytes, they're adhesive cells, they stick together, they're in their position, and they just maintain the bone. Whereas the trabecular bone, they do not have these, and we'll see what they have there. So if we look at compact bone a little bit more in detail, we'll see that it sort of resides into these sort of circular cylinders, right? And these cylinders have these blood vessels called the central canals, and they sort of communicate together. as you can see, the compact bone here is much thicker than the spongy bone, and it's responsible for the strength of the bone. And you have different types of lamellae. You have concentric lamellae, which go into the circle, which make these osteons, and then you have outer circumferential lamellae. You also have interstitial lamellae, and lamellae just means it's the channels through which the osteocytes exist. Okay, and they make these little grooves. So when you look at it on a microscope, what you will see is you'll have a circle, you'll have this, and you'll have a lot of circles around it, right? So you'll have another there, and another there, and you'll have all your little cells like this. So this was the question that we had in my first year exam. It was to draw the histology of a bone, and basically what they wanted you to do and label it was to say, like, this is an osteon, that's the central canal, and this is the lamellae. And a year after that, they showed a picture of a microscope, and basically you were asked, what do you see? Now, osteons are quite important for many different reasons. They serve to give the strength to the bone, and what you see here is that these osteocytes, they communicate with each other to make sure that the bone is kept well. You see, these are quite permanent structures, so the compact bone does not regenerate that often. The turnover, which means how much the bone regenerates, is far smaller than the trabeculi. And as you can see that the compact bone is on the outside, right? And we have these perforating canals from outside of the bone going in, but you can also have them within the bone, as you can see here through the central canal here. But you have these external blood vessels, which through the perforating Sharpie fibers enable passage of nutrients into the bone. Okay, and all these osteocytes that you see, they take nutrients from the blood vessels here. And the blood vessels, they sort of fan out concentrically, so they go from here, and the blood supply is like that, and the drainage is like that. So an osteon, it's a singular unit. That's all you really need to remember. And it's usually found in the outside. And another key thing is that they align themselves, or that the osteocytes and osteoblasts build within the direction of the force. So let's say you're running, or let's say you're standing, they adapt based on the direction of the stress. So that's sort of like the rundown on compact bone. Talk about cancellous bone, so it's a little bit different. It has many different names, some called spongy bone. And you have these trabeculi. It's like these little paths. And as you can see, they're much simpler than the osteons. They lack a unit, and they have these gaps, which sort of ensure that you have that the bone is lighter, and it can be filled with bone marrow and all these other things. Now, same thing, you have an osteoclast on the outside, you have osteocytes within the tissue, you have your lacunae where they sit, and you have your lamellae, which is the sort of the rotations of the tissue. Now, here you have all these spaces I talked about before. That's for the red bone marrow, and this is usually found on like your hips, your shoulder, so like in your humerus, the top part of your humerus. And basically, this is where we try to get bone marrow from. So you usually drill into it and they take it out. And as you can see, it's the epiphyseal line. So this is where you have your bone marrow. This is where all the bone marrow cells and your hematopoietic cells exist. As you can see, these bones, this type of bone is much smaller, much simpler. And the reason for this is because it sort of reproduces, or it turns over much more quickly. That's why these sort of units are much smaller, so that the osteoclast and the osteoblasts can react much more quickly. The osteoblasts are aligned around the trabecula of the new bone, so they make the bone and they go where the trabeculars are, and they sort of help guide the direction. Now, so the key difference between the two, this is what they're going to ask you about the question, is that the location of the compact bone, that it's under the diaphysis, right? Whereas cancellous bone is usually under the compact bone. The unit of a compact bone is an osteon, whereas in the cancellous bone, it's usually trabecular. It's irregular, it's not consistent. The functions are slightly different. So as we said before, parts of the bone are strong. So this is your compact bone, strength, thickness, and grows along the lines of stress. This is what ensures that your bones don't fall apart. Now the cancellous bone, they reduce the overweight of the bone. They provide support and protection for the red bone marrow. So if we go back here, you can sort of imagine that this is where all the bone marrow is. And this is quite important because let's say you have a fracture or you are drilling. So in orthopedics, they drill to fix bones. So if you hit through here and you hit like a major area with a lot of bone marrow, suddenly all of this bone marrow can leak out, which can be a problem because then the patient might feel a bit depleted. Of course, when we do bone marrow transplants, this is where we get the bone marrow from. Now, the osteoblasts and osteocytes are located in different areas. So as we said, the osteoblasts are found in these little windows called lacunae, whereas in the cancellous bone, they're outside the lacunae. And the osteocytes have projections in the compact bone, which form canaliculi, which just means small little channels in Latin. Whereas the osteocytes in cancellous bones, they are found inside the lacunae. And this basically serves their different functions because the osteocytes in the compact bone make permanent connections to maintain the bone, whereas cancellous bone is constantly being regenerated. So they serve different purposes for that. So that's all for the structure and function. Now we're going to talk about that's all about structure. Now we're going to talk about the function. So we have bone turnover, bone formation, and bone repair. So bone turnover is basically bone formation combined with bone resorption. And bone repair is the balance of bone formation versus bone resorption. So if you have repair, which if it works well, then it means it's balanced. If you have any imbalance, you might have osteoporosis. You might have bones which are forming, but the old bone is not being resorbed. And that means that the bone is weaker. It's not being carved. It's not being remodeled. Or you can have the opposite, that your formation is fine, but your bone resorption here, right? So your resorption is high, and your formation is low, which is your classic osteoporosis. So bone formation, I like to break it down into simple ways. It's the cells, it's the structure, and the mineralization. So cells, so you have your osteoblasts, so which they build the bone. So they secrete osteoid. Osteoid is just bone tissue. Bone tissue. And collagen. Now the structures which are formed, this is the concentric lamellae and the osteoid, which forms around the central canal. So as we said, you have the central canal, which is a blood vessel, right? So that's your blood. And then they form osteons around that. So what this is called is a concentric lamellae. And you form these cylinders. Then you have mineralization. So this is your ECM surrounds the osteoblasts because they're producing them. It mineralizes, and the osteoblasts turn into osteocytes. And then the bone matrix, so this process sort of happens over and over many years. And it's kick-started in puberty, which is where you get your growth spurt, and it accumulates over several years. Then we have bone resorption. So the cells involved here are your osteoclasts, which are attracted to bone tissue via macrophage colon-stimulating factor and other things. So the bone tissue has these cells called stromal cells. It's just a fancy way of saying cells found within the bone. And they secrete all these little chemical messengers. One of them is macrophage colon-stimulating factor. This is something you need to know. And this attracts the osteoclasts. Now you have rank L, which is a rank ligand, which is produced by the osteoblasts, and this sort of helps mature the osteoclasts. Then the osteoclasts do what they do best. They release factors, that's your cathepsin K, TGF-beta, and matrix metalloproteinases, which basically act as enzymes that go to the bone and break it down. Cathepsin K and TGF-beta, they help facilitate this. They help attract other cells to aid the osteoclasts. The end result is you resorb calcium and bone tissue. And this is very important because if you just form bone but don't remodel it, then the bone will become weak, architecturally weak, right? Think of it like just pouring cement and not doing anything with it. You need the osteoclast to shape it and carve it. Now, this is quite an important part here. We have hormones that increase the activity, which is your parathyroid hormone, glucocorticoids, and calcitriol, and hormones that decrease activity, which is your osteoprotegrin, which binds to RANKL to stop osteoclasts, and estrogen, which helps osteoprotegrin. And this is important for your exams. This comes up in questions, MCQs, MEQs. This is something you need to remember. And we'll have a question about that down the line. So yeah, now it's question time. And the first question is, what are the functions of a healthy bone? So this is 5 marks. This is sort of typical question. And you just think about it, right? What does the bone do? So you move your bone through its attachment to muscles. It acts as a reservoir for calcium and phosphate. Don't forget, it's also for phosphate because calcium and phosphate, they interact together. And when the kidneys say that you need more calcium, well, then they'll release from the bones. Same thing with phosphate. They resist stresses produced by weight. So this is especially the compact bone. So be it you running, walking, carrying something, the bone resists this stress, which would otherwise sort of affect the joints. It would affect the muscles. It will affect everything else. It also supports the muscles and tissues. So you want to lift something, right? Your bones facilitate that, but it also supports the muscles by giving it attachment points where it can actually be useful. There's also other tissues such as ligaments or other bones, and it also supports other tissues by protecting them. So it protects the tissues, like if you think about the rib cage, it protects the important parts. Think about the skull, it protects your brain. And then we have bones that can contain red or yellow bone marrow, which produce blood cells. And these blood cells are very important because you need them to propagate your immune cells. We also have other cells which are produced through these blood cells. This would be red blood cells, which are important to give you oxygen. So the bones are very important in that regard, and they have more than one sort of function. So yeah, but these are the 5 key ones. They ask for 5 marks. Usually it's 5 things. And if for 3 marks, then you pick whichever one you want out of these 3. Now, this is a typical question. This is asked nearly every single year. It's either bone healing, cartilage healing, or tendon healing, right? So it's these 3. And the process is the same. It's just the cells are different. So the way I like to think about this is inflammation, repair, and remodeling. It's simple, so it's IRR. So inflammation, you'll have your fracture hematoma, right? And inflammation, which occurs 6 to 8 hours after injury. You fracture your bone, you get the hematoma forming, right? So you have your bone here, like this. You break it, and you have a little hematoma, right? That's just the blood coming out and trying to heal it. You have inflammation because whenever you break tissue, you get inflammation because the cells burst and release all these chemicals. You get all the chemicals coming out. And this usually occurs 6 to 8 hours after the injury. Now you attract platelets and other immune cells, which release cytokines. And as we know, cytokines are chemical messengers and inflammatory messengers, which cause inflammation and recruit more cells to the site. So the first phase is, there's a problem, alert us, we need to get the people on there. So that's what inflammation is. So it's sort of an alert, danger signal for other cells to come in and fix things. Then we have repair. So your hematoma is organized into granulation tissue, and granulation tissue is basically an infiltrate of all these inflammatory cells trying to invade and regenerate the tissue. So what's formed initially is something called a soft precallus. And the reason it's called a soft precallus is because fibroblasts, which are very similar to osteoblasts, invade tissue and they release fibrocartilage. And this sort of lasts around 3 weeks. Now, the initial part of the fibrocartilage is because these cells are simpler, they're more readily available, and they're less specialized, and they can produce this cartilage very quickly. It's the scaffolding for which the bone is placed. Now, this is really, it's really weak. an ineffective tissue. It's not going to be useful, it's not going to be strong, but it has to be there as a first line of thing. Then you have osteoblasts, which invade the tissue, and they form something called woven bone to replace the fibrocartilage. So they sort of they invade the tissue that the fibroblasts made, and they replace it. And this also occurs 3 weeks after the fracture and lasts 3 to 4 months. So we had our inflammation, we had our repair, now we need some remodeling. So osteoblasts did their thing, they become osteocytes, they maintain the bone. But we need osteoclasts to come in, remodel the bone into compact and trabecular bones and to specialize them. And this woven bone, which is like the primitive bone, is then specialized into the compact, which makes the osteons, and the trabecular bone, which with their trabeculae. And they serve the different purposes. And then you have a healed bone. Question 3. So we have list the factors that affect bone healing. So when something is, like when there's an injury, there's always going to be 2 factors. It's going to be the patient themselves, and there's going to be other medications they're taking. So if they ask for 4 marks, you can do at least 3 of each if you want to be safe. They only count the first 2. So for patient factors, it's always increased age, alcohol, and smoking. So all the processes of the cells, all the inflammation. Alcohol and smoking causes more inflammation, and if you have too much inflammation, the cells become sort of unable to target the healing properly. That's sort of the working hypothesis. You can have anemia, so this means that there's not enough blood cells, red blood cells being, providing all the oxygen and all the nutrients to sort of help heal the process. And hypoparathyroidism, so when we said that a parathyroid hormone increases bone turnover, increases osteoclastic activity, hypoparathyroidism decreases, and therefore the bone healing will be weak. Next thing, we have medications. This is your NSAIDs, so your ibuprofens, your COX-2 inhibitors. They decrease vascularity at the fracture site, and this is why you are unable to get good bone healing, because healing is comprised of good supply, so you need good blood supply, otherwise you can't get the cells to the place, and infection. So if you have infection, that won't work. If you have bad blood supply, it will be necrotic and the tissue will just die instead of heal. So NSAIDs affect this because of the way they inhibit prostaglandin release. Steroids, on the other hand, they affect the osteoblasts directly. They inhibit them and the osteoclasts themselves. But steroids primarily inhibit the osteoblast, and they do this by binding to them, the signaling lecture that bind to them, and they cause change in their activities. Now, bisphosphonates, which have very long half-lives, which means that they stay in your system for very long, inhibit osteoclastic activity. Now, if bisphosphonates were out of your system really quickly, that would be great, right? But they aren't, and they stay there, and that the osteoclasts can't do their job. Now, you might ask, bisphosphonates are used in osteoporosis. Yes, they are. But if a patient has bisphosphonates and they've had a fracture, well, you want to take them off the bisphosphonates because their fracture won't heal. Or you might want to change their dose or change their bisphosphonate because you need the bone to heal, and that takes priority over the osteoporosis. So question 4, we have, how do the following affect bone turnover? So we have parathyroid hormone, glucocorticoids, calcitriol, estroprotegerin, and estrogen. So this question often occurs in MCQs, but it's good to know the underlying physiology behind it. So parathyroid hormone, glucocorticoids, and calcitriol, they increase bone turnover by promoting rank L formation and inhibiting OPG, whereas those that decrease bone turnover is your OPG and estrogens. So PTH increases osteoclast activity because it inhibits all the stuff that sort of blocks osteoclastic activities, that's OPG, and it stimulates rank L production from osteoblasts. Glucocorticoids, on the other hand, they promote rank L and also inhibit OPG, so it's the same thing. So they promote rank L, you get more osteoclasts working, and therefore you have improved bone turnover. And then finally you have calcitriol, which is activated vitamin D, and this stimulates rank L formation. And this is because you want the osteoclasts to increase their activity to get more calcium. So vitamin D and calcium come hand in hand. What decreases bone turnover is estrogen and OPG, which is your osteoprotegrin. This protects the bone because it binds to the rank L, and it inhibits differentiation because it binds to it, and then the osteoclast can't use that. Estrogen, once again, it increases OPG, and therefore, by extension, it inhibits osteoclast activity. Final question: how does mechanical stress from exercise help promote bone remodeling? So when patients have weak bones, you want to promote, you want them to do more exercises, because when they have more exercise, they strengthen the bones. Well, how does this happen? So if we look here at normal trabecular bone, you can see it's nice and has these nice trabeculae and has spaces for all the bone marrow. Now, if we have trabecular bone with resorption areas, this is osteoclasts, right? This is what happens where you have exercise, and these cracks, the cells come in and they remodel the bone. If you have osteoporosis, you have very poor architecture, right? So you have to be much more careful with exercise than when you have osteoporosis. But if you have these two, then exercising will help strengthen the bones. And this is how it works. So initially you have mechanical stress. So mechanical stress is movement, weight-bearing activity, and it causes these things called micro damage or micro cracks. And this is the same thing that you have in your muscles. It's the same thing that you have in tendons. The regeneration is very similar. So what happens here is that the osteocytes, remember the cells which are within the bone, they begin to die through apoptosis. And apoptosis, the cell death, releases a lot of things, right? So this can be growth hormones, like promoting growth hormone secretion, and cytokines. And as we said before, cytokines are these inflammatory particles which essentially cause other cells to come in and do things. That's their only purpose, to mediate processes. Now, once you have this osteocyte apoptosis, growth hormone secretion, all this stuff, you attract the cells to repair the damage, just much like when we had the bone turnover and the bone healing. Then the answer is the same, it's just bone turnover. Osteoblasts become activated, produce rank L and other messengers. Stromal cells and osteoblasts do macrophage colon stimulating factor. You have differentiation, which resorbs all damaged bone. Osteoblasts build the new bone, become osteocytes, and everything mineralizes. And you seal up the microfactors, making the bone much stronger. And yeah, so you sort of move from this to that there, normal trabecular bone. The reason I use trabecular bone is because the remodeling rate is very high, so it's quite easy to see here. With osteoids, it's a little bit different because it would be the fact that they change where the direction of the stress is. So if you have a fracture or if you have microstress, then it's more or less the same thing. Osteocytes sort of leak out their cells and the cell's contents, and other cells come in to fix them up. Okay, that's all the stuff I have for now. It's a much shorter session. But yeah, so the video will be replayable after the session. If you can, leave us some feedback on how to improve the session and what you would like us to do next. If it was helpful, give it a like, subscribe if you like more. And yeah, if anyone has any questions, do ask. It could be this topic, could be any topic. If something needs more explanation, just let me know. And if anyone has any questions, this video will be made available. You can just put them in the comments and we'll respond to them. The idea with this is to make regular weekly stuff to help you guys with the anatomy that was taught online. didn't have labs, so we're hoping that we can be of help to the first years, especially because it's your first year in medical school. It's quite difficult. Everything's online, and we need some feedback to see where the challenging areas are. Well, if there are no further questions, then this video will be made available, and you can just click on it. It'll be chaptered so you can see what's where. And if there are no questions, you can just aim them at our Facebook page or directly at YouTube. Right, I hope that was all helpful for everyone.